The morning of June 18th, 1815, began under low, overcast skies. Wet ground soaked the boots of French soldiers who had camped near the village of La Belle Alliance, just south of Waterloo. Rain had fallen heavily the night before, turning fields into muck. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, stood atop a slight ridge, scanning the horizon with his spyglass. He was 45 years old, weary from years of war, yet still cloaked in the aura of military genius. Across the plain, British forces under the Duke of Wellington formed in silence. Prussian columns under Marshal Blucher were on the march from the east, but not yet visible. This would be no ordinary battle. This was the end game. Napoleon knew it. So did Wellington. The French army, numbering around 73,000 men, was composed of veterans and conscripts, dragoons, cuirassiers, artillerymen, and the feared Imperial Guard. Napoleon had returned to power only 3 months earlier. After escaping exile on Elba, the coalition of European powers had declared him an outlaw. He needed a decisive victory to break their will and force negotiations. Wellington, meanwhile, had 68,000 men, a mixture of British regulars, Dutch Belgians, Hanoverians, and other German units. His army was not uniformly experienced, but he had discipline and strong defensive positions. His infantry was posted behind the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, shielded from direct artillery fire. The layout was deliberate. Wellington intended to receive Napoleon's attack and hold fast until Blucher arrived. Fighting began late in the morning due to the muddy terrain. Napoleon delayed the assault, hoping the ground would dry for artillery movement. When cannon finally opened fire around 11:30 a.m., the field shuddered with thunder. The French directed their first major attack on the chateau of Hougoumont, a stone farmhouse complex fortified by British guards. What was meant to be a diversion turned into a brutal struggle that lasted the entire day. Waves of French infantry were hurled against its walls and gardens. Thousands died trying to breach it. Wellington committed reinforcements to hold the position, while Napoleon, misjudging its importance, fed more men into the slaughter. The ground around Hougoumont turned red with blood, corpses clogging the gates and ditches. To the center, Marshal Ney launched a massive infantry assault in the early afternoon. French columns advanced across the valley, banners whipping in the wind, drums pounding. They met disciplined British musket fire from behind the crest. Volley after volley cut through their ranks. Cannonballs tore limbs from bodies. Still, the French pressed on, managing to capture the farmhouse of La Haye-Saint at the center. This created a breach in Wellington's line, but the British commander remained calm. He moved reserves carefully, sealing gaps and refusing to counterattack too early. His style was methodical, defensive, unlike Napoleon's aggressive reliance on momentum. Around 4 p.m., Ney ordered a massive cavalry charge, believing the British were retreating. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. British infantry had formed squares, tight formations bristling with bayonets on all sides. Cavalry charges bounced off them like waves on rock. The French cuirassiers rode again and again, suffering horrendous losses. Artillery could not follow them into the charge due to the muddy terrain. Horses fell. Riders were shot from the saddle. Sabers clashed against musket barrels. Ney, without infantry support or artillery coordination, had wasted the elite cavalry. The battlefield was now a morass of corpses, shattered guns, splintered wagons. The dead and dying screamed under hooves. By early evening, the Prussians finally arrived. Blucher's forces had marched through the mud, enduring extreme exhaustion to reach the battlefield. They struck Napoleon's right flank near the village of Plancenoit. The French fought desperately to hold them back. Napoleon diverted his young guard, and later the old guard, to counter the Prussian advance. Fighting was savage, bayonets, knives, club muskets. Plancenoit burned. Control of the village changed hands multiple times. But with each hour, more Prussians arrived. Their pressure stretched the French line thinner and thinner. Still, Napoleon refused to retreat. He believed a final blow could break Wellington before the Prussians fully deployed. As dusk approached, Napoleon gathered the Imperial Guard, the most feared, loyal unit in his army. These were men who had never broken in battle. He ordered them forward in a last desperate assault against Wellington Center. The Guard marched up the slope, black bearskin hats tall, their boots splashing through pools of blood. British troops waited behind the ridge. When the Guard crested the hill, hidden infantry rose and fired point-blank. The Guard staggered. Musket volleys, then cannon fire, then a bayonet charge. The unthinkable happened. The Guard broke. They turned. They ran. Panic swept through the French army. "La Garde recule," someone cried. The Guard is retreating. Soldiers dropped weapons, fled into the woods, trampled each other in chaos. Officers tried to rally them, but it was over. Napoleon rode among the wreckage, trying to form a rear guard. He was silent, pale. The Emperor of the French, undefeated for a decade, had lost everything in a single day. As night fell, rain returned, washing the dead in cold silence. The field at Waterloo was littered with over 40,000 casualties, men who had died in ditches on muddy hills, inside burning farms. It was not just a battlefield defeat. It was the end of an era. Napoleon had gambled everything, his empire, his legacy, his final chance to shape Europe, and it had all collapsed in a single stormy Belgian field. The morning after Waterloo was quiet in a way only death can silence a place. Mist clung low to the churned earth. The fields between La Haye-Saint and Hougoumont were no longer recognizable as land for crops or cattle. They were raw with torn earth, trampled bodies, shattered equipment. French wounded moaned in the gullies. British and Prussian soldiers moved among the heaps of dead, stripping corpses of boots, rations, rings, and coins. The stench of gunpowder and blood was overpowered only by the rising rot of thousands of bodies, many of them still twitching with the final stages of life. Napoleon had fled the field before dawn, leaving Marshal Soult to organize what remained of the army, what had been the Grande Armée, a force that once terrorized all of Europe from Portugal to Moscow, was now no more than a scattered rabble fleeing south toward France. Horses without riders wandered the roads. Artillery pieces were abandoned in ditches. Whole battalions simply ceased to exist. The Prussians pursued mercilessly. Blücher, driven by hatred from the humiliation at Ligny days earlier, ordered no rest. French stragglers were cut down without quarter. The defeat at Waterloo was not just a collapse of tactics. It was a complete disintegration of French military power. In Paris, news arrived before Napoleon did. Rumors spread like fire, first that the emperor had won, then that he had died, then the truth. Panic took hold. The Chamber of Deputies, still uncertain how to treat Napoleon after his return from Elba, now moved to distance itself. When Napoleon arrived on June 21st, exhausted, disheveled, he found no applause, no welcome. France was not ready to go through another cycle of war. His presence had brought the wrath of every European monarch down upon them again, and now there was no army left to defend the capital. Within days, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. But this time there was no escape, no Elba. The British had learned. He would not be permitted to return again. While French politicians scrambled to arrange a provisional government and negotiate peace, the Allies marched steadily toward Paris. The Prussians reached the gates first. Only the British restrained them from sacking the city in vengeance. For Napoleon, all routes were closed. He surrendered to the captain of the HMS Bellerophon and was transported not to Europe, but to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, beyond the reach of any rescue. Waterloo marked a final, irreversible point in European history. For over a decade, Napoleon had dictated the politics of the continent. He had dissolved empires, raised client kings, rewritten laws. Now, the old order began to reassert itself. The Congress of Vienna had already been in session, but Waterloo confirmed its mandate. Monarchies were restored. Borders were reestablished. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain now determined the fate of Europe, not France. In a single day, the gravitational pull of Europe shifted entirely away from Paris. But for the men who had fought, the consequences were more immediate. Surgeons worked nonstop in makeshift hospitals behind both lines. Limbs were hacked off without anesthesia. Wounds festered in the heat. Survivors were scarred, many blind, deaf, crippled. The fields around Waterloo were left for weeks unburied, dogs and birds picking at the corpses. Local peasants looted the dead and burned what they could not use. Bones were harvested later for fertilizer. Musket balls dug out of walls for scrap. Veterans of the battle returned to lives that no longer fit them. In Britain, Wellington was hailed as a hero, but he knew the cost. He said, "Next to a battle lost, the greatest misery is a battle gained." He had seen the slaughter firsthand. Unlike the legends told later, Waterloo had not been a clean victory of British discipline over French arrogance. It had been brutal, chaotic, nearly lost. Only the arrival of Blucher and the failure of Ney had turned the tide. In France, soldiers returned to humiliation. The defeat shattered the myth of French invincibility built since the Revolution. The empire was over. Louis XVIII returned to the throne, backed by foreign bayonets. The tricolor was replaced by the Bourbon white. Napoleon's marshals were exiled, executed, or stripped of titles. France would never again dominate Europe as it had in those revolutionary decades. It would become a secondary player for a generation, its politics fractured, its people disillusioned. In the decade that followed, Waterloo was mythologized and analyzed endlessly. Monuments were raised, battle maps drawn, memoirs published. The name became a shorthand for final defeat, a warning to all who rose too far, too fast. Yet in 1815, the immediate aftermath was simpler. A field full of corpses, a fallen emperor in chains, and a continent returning, temporarily, to the old balance of power. Nothing else mattered that summer. Napoleon had lost everything, and he had lost it all in a single, brutal day. The long shadow of Waterloo reached beyond the battlefield, haunting Europe's political halls and military academies for decades. It wasn't just a defeat of a man. It was a collapse of an era defined by volatility, ambition, and violence on a scale that Europe had never seen. The soldiers who had followed Napoleon from the frozen plains of Russia to the sunlit valleys of Italy now returned to find their purpose erased. Some had enlisted as teenagers and knew nothing else. The tricolor had fallen, and with it, their future. Officers of the former Grande Armée were watched with suspicion, many barred from positions in the new royalist military. Veterans without land or pensions begged in the streets of Paris. In France, the loss created a cultural wound. The monarchy was restored under Louis XVIII, but it came tethered to humiliation. French pride had been built for 15 years on victories: Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. Now the new government had to govern a people who had once marched with emperors and now answered to kings imposed by foreign powers. Louis XVIII tried to walk a careful line, rewarding loyalists but avoiding open persecution of Bonapartists. But the mood was unstable. Bonapartist veterans formed secret societies. Discontent brewed in army garrisons. The defeat at Waterloo became a symbol not just of lost glory, but betrayal. By fate, by generals, by politicians. The Bourbon Restoration tried to erase Napoleon from public life, but his presence was too large. Songs, prints, and even whispered stories kept him alive in memory. Children played games reenacting his battles. Artists painted him not as a tyrant, but as a tragic hero. Waterloo, meanwhile, became an awkward topic. The government could not celebrate it. Yet the people could not forget it. The word Waterloo hung in the air like a shameful secret, too painful to speak, too large to ignore. Across the Channel, the British Empire drew strength from its victory. For Britain, Waterloo was more than a battle. It was validation. After 20 years of war, economic strain, and fear of invasion, the British had stood firm. Wellington was elevated to near-mythic status. He was awarded titles, wealth, and political power. The British Army, long considered a secondary force behind its navy, now had a defining moment to rally around. Statues were raised. Streets renamed. Children memorized the details of the charge of the Scots Greys, the stand of the 27th Inniskilling, the last volley fired against the Imperial Guard. But even in victory, the truth was sobering. British casualties were immense. Over 15,000 killed and wounded. The ranks had been filled with Irish conscripts, German auxiliaries, and militia. Their sacrifice was quietly buried beneath the noise of celebration. Many families received no compensation, no recognition. Widows and orphans crowded poorhouses. Veterans wandered the countryside with amputated limbs and haunted eyes. The state celebrated the outcome, not the cost. In Prussia, Blücher's role in the final victory gave Berlin new influence. The Prussian military, hardened by years of defeats and reforms, had proven its worth. Officers like Gneisenau and von Muffling became national figures. More importantly, Prussia's participation in Waterloo elevated it within the German Confederation. It marked the beginning of Prussia's rise as a dominant German state, a trajectory that would continue to the 19th century and culminate in unification under Bismarck decades later. For Prussia, Waterloo was a badge of legitimacy. It had faced Napoleon, and it had helped end him. The smaller German states that had fought at Waterloo, Hanover, Brunswick, Nassau, returned home to shifting allegiances. Some had fought alongside the British, others against Napoleon. Now they recalibrated. The post-Waterloo period saw a reassertion of monarchic authority and suppression of liberal movements inspired by the French Revolution. Carlsbad decrees, censorship, surveillance. These were the tools of the new order. Waterloo had extinguished not just Napoleon, but the revolutionary fire he carried. In Belgium, the battle had been fought on its soil, but the dead came from across Europe. The local population, stunned by the scale of destruction, became caretakers of the battlefield by default. Farmers plowed around the bodies. Children played with shattered muskets. The ground bore scars that would not heal. The area around Mont Saint-Jean and La Haye-Saint remained dotted with graves, memorials, and abandoned equipment. In time, visitors came. Veterans returned. Pilgrimages began. Waterloo became a place of memory, of mourning for some, of pride for others. As the years passed, the memory of the battle morphed. The reality, mud, blood, screams, was replaced by legend. Painful details were smoothed over. Writers and politicians polished the chaos into a tale of heroism and destiny. For Britain, it became a national epic. For France, a tragic loss. For Germany, a step toward future unity. Each nation carved its own story from the same field of death. Yet beneath the myth, Waterloo remained what it had always been, a brutal, senseless butchery of men. A place where tactics failed and courage died in mud. Where the fate of empires turned not on grand strategy, but on luck, timing, and exhaustion. Where Napoleon's genius failed to account for delay and terrain. Where Ney's impetuous charges shattered cavalry against unbroken squares. Where the Imperial Guard, unbroken for decades, finally cracked under pressure of musket fire and disbelief. Waterloo was not just the fall of Napoleon. It was the grave of an entire generation. It closed the book on the Revolutionary Wars and opened the door to a century of fragile peace built on repression and control. It reminded every monarch, every general, every ambitious leader that power gained by force can vanish in a single day. A lesson bought at the highest price. In the months following the defeat, France's internal divisions deepened. The army was gutted, the monarchy restored, but the soul of the country was fractured. Those who had risen under Napoleon, soldiers, bureaucrats, merchants, now faced an uncertain future under the Bourbons. Many were dismissed from their posts. Bonapartist symbols were outlawed. Public commemorations of the empire were suppressed. The government, fearful of renewed insurrection, authorized secret police to monitor veterans and suspected conspirators. Prisons filled not with criminals, but with patriots of the fallen regime. Royalist mobs attacked known Bonapartists. Revenge replaced reconciliation. In the streets of Paris, people whispered the word Waterloo not as history, but as a wound. Yet the memory could not be buried. Even in defeat, Napoleon's legend grew. In secret, veterans met in taverns and backrooms, sharing tales of the march to Moscow, the crossing of the Alps, the thunder of cannon at Borodino, and finally, the disaster of Waterloo. For many, that last battle became a symbol not of failure, but of loyalty. We were still with him at the end, they would say. Underground presses distributed poems and pamphlets glorifying the emperor's last stand. Miniatures of his face, carved from ivory or painted on watch lids, passed hand to hand. The tricolor flag reappeared in hidden corners. Even exile could not erase Napoleon's hold on the imagination. The battlefield itself, over time, became a monument without design. Bones surfaced with every rain. Mass graves, hastily dug, failed to contain the dead. Travelers recounted finding skeletons exposed in trenches, uniforms faded but buttons still gleaming. Scavengers picked through the debris, locals looters, foreign collectors. Helmets, swords, muskets, even teeth were removed and sold. Waterloo became a grotesque marketplace of death. In London, surgeons and apothecaries bought bones and skulls labeled from the Emperor's battlefield. Museums paid handsomely for relics, whether authentic or forged. Tourism followed. British aristocrats eager to bask in the triumph of empire came by coach to see the ground where Wellington had stood. Guides, many former soldiers, led them from La Belle Alliance to Hougoumont, recounting each movement of the day. Some embellished. Others simply pointed to where they had nearly died. Locals sold souvenirs carved from ruined farmhouses. Vendors hawked lead musket balls, shards of saber, and red-stained stones said to bear the blood of the Imperial Guard. These journeys, solemn or theatrical, transformed the memory of Waterloo into something commercial, profitable, controllable. For military thinkers, the battle became a case study, not because of its brilliance, but because of its flaws. Staff colleges across Europe dissected the command structures, troop movements, and miscommunications. Why had Napoleon delayed the attack? Why had Ney exhausted the cavalry? Why had Grouchy failed to prevent the Prussians from reaching the field? These questions were debated endlessly. New maps were drawn, theories tested. In time, these analyses fed into the next generation of warfare. Ironically, the slaughter of 1815 helped shape the strategies that would be deployed decades later in Crimea and beyond. But the most significant transformation was psychological. Waterloo imposed an invisible limit on ambition. It was a reminder that even the greatest empire, led by the most brilliant commander of his age, could be undone in a matter of hours. European monarchs ruled more cautiously afterward. Revolutionary movements, though still alive, were forced into hiding. Liberal thinkers learned to move carefully, to cloak their ideas in gradualism. For a time, the fear of another Napoleon kept even the boldest reformers in check. In St. Helena, Napoleon watched the world he once dominated from afar. The island, windswept and isolated, was a prison without walls. He lived in Longwood House, surrounded by a small circle of loyal officers. He was guarded constantly, his letters read, his movements restricted. He had lost command, his army, his throne, but most painfully, he had lost relevance. Yet he still dictated his version of events, shaping how posterity would remember him. Waterloo, in his telling, was not a failure of strategy, but a betrayal of fate. He blamed the rain, Grouchy, even Ney, never himself. His memoirs would become the foundation of the Napoleonic myth, the tragic hero undone by forces beyond his control. Back in Europe, the victors tried to restore the old world. The Congress of Vienna redrew borders to ensure no single power could dominate again. New alliances were formed. The Holy Alliance, the Concert of Europe. These arrangements created a fragile peace, sustained not by justice but by suppression. Revolts in Naples, in Spain, in the German states were crushed swiftly. Waterloo had not brought freedom. It had brought order, rigid, reactionary, repressive. And yet the ideas Napoleon carried, meritocracy, legal equality, secular governance, did not die. They went underground, took root in books, in secret societies, in universities. The students who would one day march in 1848 grew up hearing stories of Waterloo not as a defeat, but as a moment when dreams nearly triumphed over tradition. The battlefield, soaked in failure, became fertile ground for the seeds of the next revolution. By the mid-19th century, monuments began to rise. In Belgium, a great mound was built, topped with a lion statue. The lion's mound was meant to commemorate the Allied victory, but to French veterans, it was an insult, a scar placed deliberately on the field where their brothers had fallen. They called it a desecration. Still, pilgrims came. Former officers, now elderly and gray, stood quietly by the memorials, their eyes tracing invisible formations in the grass. The field had healed, but memory had not. Waterloo endured in the language. The phrase, "to meet your Waterloo," entered common speech, a final reckoning, an unavoidable defeat. For nations, it was a caution. For leaders, a reminder. Ambition must be tempered. Glory is fleeting. Even emperors can be broken in a single day. As decades passed, The deeper political tremors unleashed by Waterloo continued to reshape Europe's foundations. The 1815 defeat had silenced the cannons, but had not killed the revolutionary fever Napoleon once embodied. Across the continent, the post-Waterloo era was marked by tension between the forces of reaction and the embers of reform. In Paris, the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy never fully stabilized. Kings wore their crowns with the awareness that another collapse could come from within, not just from war, but from memory. The specter of Napoleon remained, alive in art, in speech, in silence. Entire generations of French citizens grew up under the shadow of loss. Veterans of the Grande Armée aged into bitterness. Their sons listened to stories of glory and betrayal, not of kings. Some became officers under the restored monarchy, hiding their loyalties. Others withdrew from public life entirely, unwilling to serve a regime they considered illegitimate. In rural France, the defeat at Waterloo was not discussed with shame, but with defiance. Men raised glasses in back rooms and tapped fingers twice on the table, an old army sign of allegiance to the emperor. The tricolor never disappeared from French hearts, even when it vanished from official buildings. The political elite of France, meanwhile, attempted to erase 1789 to 1815 as if it had been a fever dream. The Napoleonic Code, which had standardized laws and civil rights across vast regions, remained too useful to abolish. Yet any mention of Napoleon in public life was carefully censored. Plays that referenced imperial triumphs were shut down. Painters were discouraged from portraying the man. But censorship could not outmatch nostalgia. Smugglers brought back medals and memorabilia from abroad. Secret societies such as the Carbonari, and later the Society of the Rights of Man, drew ideological strength from the idea of resurrection, not just of the emperor himself, but the values he had carried. Across Germany, the effect of Waterloo had been paradoxical. While Prussia gained enormous prestige and momentum, the smaller German states found themselves caught between old sovereignty and emerging nationalism. Waterloo had given German soldiers a shared story, an enemy defeated, a field survived. That unity, however, was not backed by a unified political system. The German Confederation, a loose association of 39 states created after the Congress of Vienna, was weak. The people who had marched against Napoleon began to ask why their loyalty had not yielded constitutional reforms or national unity. In the years after 1815, discontent swelled beneath the surface. Students, veterans, intellectuals began pressing for a new Germany. Not the patchwork of petty monarchies and duchies, but a single state with shared purpose. These movements were watched closely by conservative regimes. After all, they knew where the flame had been lit. In the crucible of Napoleonic Wars, crowned by Waterloo, the Carlsbad Decrees of 1819, aimed at crushing academic freedom, banning nationalist organizations, and increasing censorship, were a direct response to the ideological residue of Napoleon's legacy. In Britain, the consequences of Waterloo were felt not just in celebration, but in burden. The victory solidified Britain's role as a central power in European politics. It committed the nation to foreign entanglements for decades. Troop deployments, diplomacy, and the need to maintain balance across the continent became permanent fixtures of British governance. The expense of the Napoleonic Wars had already crippled the treasury. After Waterloo, the cost of maintaining peace came in the form of heavy taxation and imperial overreach. Wellington, for his part, became a symbol of unyielding conservatism. Elevated to the highest ranks of nobility, he entered politics and eventually became prime minister. But his refusal to entertain democratic reforms earned him scorn among the growing middle class. Crowds jeered him. His house was attacked during protests. The Iron Duke, once hailed as a savior of Europe, became a figure of the past, unmoving, out of step with the world Waterloo had left behind. Even he recognized this, once remarking bitterly that the people he had saved from Napoleon now treated him as a relic. Meanwhile, Napoleon's exile to St. Helena became its own form of legend. The island, thousands of miles from any major power, was selected to ensure he would never return. His every movement was tracked. His visitors were monitored, his letters censored. And yet, Napoleon continued to manipulate perception. He dictated memoirs to loyal followers, crafting a version of history where he was a reluctant conqueror, forced into war by hostile monarchies. Waterloo, in his telling, was not a defeat of merit, but a betrayal, by reign, by allies, by the fates. Those writings would later inspire generations. In France, the Napoleonic revival of the mid-19th century saw artists and writers reclaim the emperor's legacy. Victor Hugo, Honoré de Balzac, and others wove Napoleonic themes into their works. A mythic image of Napoleon began to form, not as a despot, but as a child of the revolution, the man of destiny, the fallen eagle. Waterloo, rather than being a national humiliation, was transformed into a tragic finale, heroic, mournful, unfinished. This revisionism had consequences. In 1840, France negotiated with Britain to return Napoleon's remains from St. Helena. His body was brought back to Paris in a ceremony of enormous national scale. Veterans lined the streets in ragged uniforms. Cannons roared. The tricolor waved again, unofficially. It was the first time since Waterloo that France had dared to publicly claim its imperial past. The ceremony was not just a funeral. It was a declaration that memory could not be suppressed, that legacy could outlive defeat. The battlefield itself, long looted and scarred, eventually became sacred. Monuments rose to individual units, to the Hanoverians at the farm of Pays Plate, to the Black Watch on the Ridge, to the French who fell at La Haye Sainte. Each nation carved its grief and pride into stone. For Belgians, the battle remained complex, fought on their soil with foreign blood. For the Dutch, it was part of state mythology. For the Germans, a step toward unity. For the British, an origin myth of empire. For the French, it was more personal, an ache that never healed. As modernity crept into Europe, trains, telegraphs, factories, the legacy of Waterloo still held firm. Politicians invoked it. Writers reimagined it. Soldiers studied it. Every uprising, every war, every revolution that followed seemed to echo that day in June 1815. Not because it had decided everything, but because it had revealed the fragility of everything. Empires, ideologies, leaders, fate. Waterloo had been more than a military clash. It was a reckoning, violent, final, unrelenting. A field became a crucible, and in its fire, the world changed forever. As the century wore on, the legacy of Waterloo matured into something even broader, a global symbol of downfall, of destiny overtaken by reality. In schools across Europe, students studied the battle not merely as a military event, but as a hinge point in the political evolution of the continent. It was a collision between two eras, the ancient order of thrones and scepters against the volcanic upheaval of revolution and meritocracy. Napoleon had carried the torch of the Enlightenment. Militarized, yes, but infused with logic, secularism, equality before the law. His defeat meant the re-entrenchment of privilege, monarchy, and inherited power. But the light he bore was not extinguished. It was scattered, absorbed, and eventually reignited in other forms. In the emerging national movements of the 19th century, the imagery of Napoleon, and by extension the loss at Waterloo, was repurposed. Italian unifiers saw in him the first pan-European leader who had crossed the Alps not to conquer, but to liberate Italians from Austrian rule. In Hungary, in Poland, in Greece, young intellectuals read his biography alongside Voltaire and Rousseau. Even in Latin America, revolutionaries like Simón Bolívar drew inspiration from his campaigns. Waterloo's importance then became inverted. It was not the death of a cause. It was a moment of martyrdom that spread the cause further than Napoleon ever could in life. In military theory, Waterloo also took on new life as technological change began transforming warfare. With the development of rifle barrels, ironclad ships, and rail transport, the Napoleonic way of war, mass infantry columns, grand artillery barges, cavalry flanks, began to look increasingly obsolete. Yet officers still studied Waterloo. They wanted to understand how decisive battles could go so wrong, how leadership could falter at the crucial moment. They examined the fog of war, the confusion, miscommunication, and misjudgment that led to Ney's reckless cavalry charge or Grouchy's ill-fated isolation. Waterloo became a case study in the unpredictability of human command under stress. The lesson that emerged was chilling. Even with the best planning, even with elite troops, defeat could come suddenly and irreversibly. Within France, the political pendulum kept swinging. The July monarchy tried to bridge the gap between monarchy and revolution, but failed. In 1848, the same year that saw upheaval across Europe, France once again erupted. The Second Republic was declared. And who rose to power through popular vote? Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the fallen emperor. His name, once outlawed, had become an asset. He had never held a sword at Waterloo, never marched with the Old Guard, yet he rode a memory of that battle all the way to the presidency, and eventually to the throne as Napoleon III. The irony was absolute. Waterloo, the battle that ended Bonapartism, gave birth to its resurrection. The new regime leaned heavily on nostalgia. Statues of Napoleon the Great were restored. Arches and bridges were renamed. Veterans' pensions were quietly reinstated. The Battle of Waterloo was publicly acknowledged, but always as a glorious defeat, not a failure. The imperial myth had returned, polished and sanitized, less revolutionary, more majestic, but it was still a living force in national identity. Elsewhere in Europe, the very idea of Waterloo began to shift into metaphor. Poets and philosophers invoked it to describe the fall of great ambitions. Political cartoons portrayed figures meeting their Waterloo in parliaments, banks, or personal scandals. It had become a shorthand, a symbol of the unavoidable reckoning that every towering ambition must face. Artists painted scenes not of tactical maneuvers, but of emotional collapse. Napoleon staring down the final charge, Wellington weary at the end of the day, dying men crawling through mud toward the impossible. The physical space of the battlefield changed too. Roads were laid down. The Lion's Mound became a landmark on maps. By the time of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, veterans of Waterloo were almost all gone, but their battle lived on as a national pilgrimage site. French soldiers marching to the front often passed near it, sometimes pausing to touch the soil or leave behind a trinket. For Germans, now unified under Prussia's leadership, Waterloo had new meaning, a precursor to their rise, a fragment of their shared military heritage. In Britain, Waterloo's legacy was woven into the expansion of empire. The generation that followed believed it had been a trial of national strength, a test Britain had passed. Public institutions carried the name proudly. Waterloo Station in London, schools, bridges, and inns. Coins and banknotes occasionally bore scenes from the battle. It was as if the empire itself had found part of its foundation in that muddy field outside Brussels. Wellington's death in 1852 prompted a massive state funeral. Carriages, soldiers, dignitaries, all beneath banners bearing the names of battles, none more prominent than Waterloo. By the early 20th century, on the eve of the First World War, the myth of Waterloo had calcified. It had become a national story for multiple nations, a sacred epic, less about the mechanics of war and more about character. Napoleon's fall was cited as a warning against autocracy. Wellington's endurance was held up as the embodiment of Anglo-Saxon stoicism. Prussia's role was reinterpreted through the lens of rising German militarism. Each nation that had bled on that field now read the same event through a different moral lens. And then came the trenches of 1914. Machine guns, poison gas, barbed wire. These were things no one at Waterloo could have imagined. Suddenly, the idea of a decisive battle seemed obsolete. The world saw that slaughter could now be industrialized, impersonal, relentless. The elegance, the drama, even the chaos of Waterloo now looked almost noble by comparison. And yet, World War I soldiers still carried Napoleon's image into battle. Officers still read accounts of Wellington's orders. Veterans still visited the battlefield, even as the fields of Flanders echoed with far greater death. Waterloo remained because it was the last moment before the modern world arrived. It was a final act of an age when men still believed one man could change the world with will, courage, and strategy alone. It was a grave of the heroic ideal, and perhaps the birth of historical realism. The mud has long dried on that Belgian field. The bones have long been buried, or lost, but still, the name endures, not because of its immediate consequences, but because of its eternal symbolism. Waterloo is not just where Napoleon fell. It is where the 19th century began, soaked in the blood of two ages clashing under storm clouds. It is the point where myth met mortality, and where ambition, however divine, was finally outmatched by the weight of the world. By the time the centenary of the battle approached in 1915, Europe was already engulfed in a war that dwarfed Waterloo in scope and savagery. The Great War obliterated any illusion that battles could be decisive in the old Napoleonic sense. The trenches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland render maneuver and cavalry obsolete. Armies no longer maneuvered across open plains and sweeping arcs. They bled out slowly in mud and wire. But even amid the horror of modern war, the memory of Waterloo clung on, not as a model but as a contrast. Officers compared the clear objectives and linear formations of 1815 with the hellish stagnation of no man's land. Historians and poets lamented the loss of an age when a man on horseback could still see the whole field. On the actual field of Waterloo, the centennial passed quietly. There were no grand ceremonies. Europe's energies were consumed by the Industrial War. Yet a few soldiers, French and British alike, stationed nearby, visited the old monuments during brief moments of leave. Some posed for photographs beside the lion's mound. Others traced fingers over the chiseled names on stone slabs. In their faces, one could see the recognition. This had been where the last old war ended, and perhaps where the idea of heroism in battle had finally died. Between the wars in the 1920s and 1930s, a wave of new historical scholarship emerged. For the first time, serious academic attention was turned to the diaries of low-ranking soldiers, the logistical records, the maps scribbled by aides de camp. The romantic image of Waterloo gave way to more granular, sobering realities. The notion of genius began to be scrutinized. Napoleon's health, his hemorrhoids, his fatigue, was discussed not to undermine him but to humanize the myth. Wellington's luck, the Prussian arrival, and even the delayed French start due to soggy ground were reassessed as pivotal. The battle was no longer seen simply as great men colliding, but as a convergence of countless fragile human factors. In 1940, the Germans once again marched through Belgium, and for a brief moment, Waterloo resurfaced in political propaganda. Nazi rhetoric invoked German unity and strength, contrasting it with the disorganized coalitions of the past. But even they did not dare reframe the battle entirely. The memory was too layered, too steeped in pan-European history. Waterloo had become a kind of shared trauma, its interpretation shifting depending on the speaker, the audience, the political need of the moment. During the German occupation of Belgium, the battlefield was left mostly untouched, though soldiers occasionally visited it, as others had in previous wars, to reflect. After the Second World War, a new Europe began to form, not of empires and monarchs, but of alliances and integration. The European Union, forged in part to prevent the recurrence of wars like those sparked in Napoleon's time, indirectly drew lessons from the chaos that followed 1815. Waterloo, once a site of division, gradually became a symbol of collective history. French, British, Belgian, German school groups visited together. Battlefield preservation efforts became multinational. Archaeological digs unearthed not just musket balls and buttons, but the shared humanity beneath the uniforms. In the late 20th century, the emergence of mass tourism gave Waterloo a new life. Tour buses rolled into the parking lots near the Lion's Mound. Interactive museums were built. Visitors watched reenactments, walked the ridge where Wellington had stood, and stood silently by the now-restored Hougoumont farm. The commercialism was obvious, but beneath it was something genuine, a curiosity, a desire to understand what happened here and why it mattered. Technological advances added new dimensions. Satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar revealed hidden burial sites, allowing historians to revise long-held assumptions. DNA testing on skeletal remains uncovered the wide ethnic makeup of Napoleon's forces. Men from Poland, Italy, the Netherlands, even Egypt. This army, once seen as purely French, was in fact pan-European. Yet another irony in a battle fought between coalitions. The same diversity appeared among the British and Allied ranks. Irish, Scots, Dutch, Germans, even Indian sepoys in supporting roles. Modern-day historians now see Waterloo not as a neat climax, but as a brutal and confused conclusion to decades of continental turmoil. It did not end war, nor did it settle ideology. It was not a clear moral victory. Napoleon was not a simple tyrant, nor Wellington a flawless savior. Waterloo was a vortex, a point where hundreds of thousands of personal destinies converged in one violent reckoning. Meanwhile, the name itself had transcended history. Waterloo appeared in literature, film, theater. Tolstoy, Byron, Hugo all referenced it. In popular culture, it became a motif for hubris undone, for final reckoning, for glorious collapse. Songs bore the name, sometimes earnestly, sometimes ironically, and yet, despite this cultural saturation, the actual event remained largely misunderstood by the general public. Few grasped the sheer chaos of the fight, the closeness of Napoleon's near victory, or the extraordinary discipline shown by common soldiers on all sides. And then, in 2015, the bicentenary arrived. This time, the world watched. Leaders from France, Britain, Germany, and Belgium gathered on the field. Speeches were given, not triumphalist, but somber. It was an event not of victory, but of remembrance. Thousands of reenactors in historically accurate uniforms bivouacked near the farms. They cooked over open fires, marched in columns, drilled in the rain. The final charge of the Imperial Guard was recreated, watched by tens of thousands. Cannons roared again, not in war, but in memory. Perhaps the most telling moment was the laying of wreaths at the mass graves. Representatives from all nations stood together. Some saluted, some bowed, some remained still. No side claimed righteousness. No nation asserted moral superiority. 200 years had passed, and finally, the battlefield belonged to history, not politics. Today, when one stands on that field, it is quiet. Corn sways where cannon once fired. Stone plaques mark where men fell. You can see the ridgeline, the distant woods, the contours that shape the movements of entire armies. There is no noise, no clamor, just the wind. And if you close your eyes, you can almost feel it. The weight of decisions made, of lives spent, of history turned. Waterloo is no longer just a battle. It is a memory carried by a continent. It is a story with no final chapter, because each generation must reinterpret what it means to rise, to fall, and to endure. And so, into the 21st century, Waterloo endures, not frozen in a single moment, but expanding in layers like sediment, each era adding its own perspective to the original catastrophe. The field itself is static, the geography unchanged. The gentle slopes, the low ridges, the farmhouses still standing like sentinels over old blood. But what humanity reads into that ground shifts subtly but continuously, influenced by politics, by education, by cultural memory. In the present age, where nations battle more with narratives than with musket fire, Waterloo has become a study in collective myth. Schools in France speak of Napoleon not as a warmonger, but as a modernizer, the man who codified law, reformed education, and built institutions that outlasted every monarch who replaced him. Waterloo, in that context, is framed as a tragic punctuation, an unjust ending to a project that aimed to rationalize a chaotic Europe. Students learn of his charisma, his innovation, his stubbornness. The defeat is acknowledged, but softened, woven into the larger pattern of French resilience. It becomes a lesson in pride tempered by reflection. In Britain, the narrative is more stoic. Wellington is praised not for genius, but for steadiness, for holding a line, making no critical mistakes, trusting his formations to endure. He was no flamboyant visionary. He was method, restraint, clarity. Waterloo in the British lens is less about a battle and more about temperament. It reinforces a national ideal of quiet determination, of doing one's duty without theatrics. That is how the victory is taught, as a triumph of cool calculation over dramatic flair. Germany, now unified long after the Prussian contribution to Waterloo, sees its role as a step in the emergence of modern German identity. Blücher, once overshadowed by Napoleon and Wellington, has been reclaimed as a symbol of grit and resolve. His forced marches, his stubborn insistence on aiding Wellington despite distance and fatigue, are held up as acts of loyalty and endurance. Prussian staff work, often buried in older narratives, is now praised in German military history for its organizational competence, qualities that would define German operations in the decades that followed. And Belgium, on whose land the battle was fought, takes a quiet pride in being custodian of this European graveyard. It has hosted the memory with a kind of humility, offering space to all interpretations, all flags, all languages. Belgians know it was not their fight, but they have protected its memory for those who must remember. In a small country shaped by centuries of being battleground and crossroads, Waterloo fits perfectly. It is a place of impact, not ownership. In the modern academic world, Waterloo has also evolved into a case study in historical complexity. Researchers examine not just the tactics or decisions, but the overlooked elements, the logistics of feeding tens of thousands of men in the days before battle, the emotional strain on officers who have been fighting wars for over a decade, the effects of rain on gunpowder and cannon fire, the psychological weight carried by veterans of Austerlitz or Leipzig. Napoleon's failure at Waterloo wasn't simply a strategic error. It was a culmination of exhaustion, overreach, misjudgment, and time itself finally running out. The conversation now also includes voices that were previously silent. Gender historians examine how women experience the aftermath. Nurses treating the wounded, wives following the army, locals tending to the fields of dead. Economic historians study the cost of the campaign, the supply contracts, the mercantile interests tied to war and its end. Social historians examine the letters and journals of ordinary soldiers, how they coped, how they survived, how they remembered. Waterloo has thus become not just a military event, but a window into an age. The structure of armies, the limits of empire, the fragility of coalitions, the pace of technological change, all can be found in the events of that one day. The relationship between leadership and morale, between timing and fate, between risk and reward, these elements, still studied in war colleges and leadership seminars, are embedded in the choices made between 11 a.m. and 8 p.m. on June 18, 1815. Even the digital age has not dulled the battle's resonance. Virtual reality now lets users walk through 3D reconstructions of the fight. Drone footage maps out the contours of the ridge Wellington defended. Algorithms model alternate outcomes based on small changes. What if Grouchy had arrived? What if the Guard had held? What if Ney had waited for support? Waterloo becomes a testbed not just for history, but for systems theory, decision-making models, and artificial intelligence simulations. In culture, the battle continues to appear in fiction, film, and art. It is featured in strategy games, referenced in political speeches, used in marketing slogans. The phrase "meeting one's Waterloo" still carries weight, a shorthand for facing a final, undoing confrontation. And in doing so, it reminds people of the fragility inherent in every towering ambition. That is perhaps its truest legacy. Not the tactics, not the flags, but the idea that no matter how high one rises, the ground is always waiting. There is also a spiritual element that continues to stir quietly beneath the surface. The sheer volume of death, the silence that follows so much violence, imbues the field with a sense of sacredness. Visitors often remark on the atmosphere, the hush, the light, the way the air feels different. Perhaps it is imagination, or perhaps some trace remains in the land itself, a weight pressed into the earth by the footfalls of men who knew they might not live another hour. Waterloo survivors, the few who lived into the late 19th century, often described the battle with a kind of detachment. It wasn't a thing they had done. It was a thing that had happened to them. They spoke more often of friends lost than of enemies defeated. They described smoke, screams, confusion. Rarely did they use the word glory. That, perhaps, is the final revision of Waterloo. In stripping away the romanticism, in embracing the weight and terror of what happened, we see it not just as an end to a war or an emperor, but as a mirror, one held up to ambition, to belief, to the moment when vision must face consequence. And in that mirror, each generation finds something different. That is why Waterloo continues. Because we keep returning to that field, not just to see what happened there, but to ask ourselves, what would we have done in the mud, under the sky, as thunder rolled and the empire collapsed?